Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing right now. Hello world, I'm Chris Pirillo, and this is your Geek Out for today. I wanted to give you a comparison between the Nexus 10, the Nexus 7, and the Nexus 4, or die trying. 3 products from the same company, and I have them all. For screen size, I gotta give it to the Nexus 10, because it's bigger than the Nexus 7 and the Nexus 4. I need another hand. Okay, we're obviously talking about 3 different types of computers for 3 different kinds of needs. In terms of feel, the Nexus 7 is palmable. The Nexus 10 certainly feels okay in landscape mode. And I really like the Nexus 4 in one hand or 2. It's just that the Nexus 10 can be a bit top heavy. Okay to hold in this orientation, a little awkward in this one. The screen is smoother on the Nexus 4, and I really appreciate the soft touch on the perimeter. The Nexus 7 doesn't really have a soft touch. I mean, other than on the back. And my Nexus 10, even with light use, seems to attract dust on the back. Could you even see the dust there? I could! Now, in terms of attracting fingerprints, the Nexus 4 handled them better. I mean, yes, we are talking about larger screens with the Nexus 10 and the 7. It's just that I don't have to wipe off the screen with the Nexus 4 as much. And being someone who is OCD, that means a lot. Ugh. It's just so slow. In terms of which device produced the crispest text, I would have to give that to the Nexus 10. Runner-up would have to be the Nexus 4, and in third place, the Nexus 7. In terms of brightness and contrast differences between the screens, there really wasn't that much of a difference. And if there was a difference, it was minor. Come on, I'm ready for the next test. While I wait for my 7 to become more responsive, let me tell you about battery life. The 10 pulls about 8 hours on average. The 4, only 6 hours. The 7 gets 10. So what about butter? I'm talking about Project Butter from Google as a part of the Jelly Bean update, and with each of these devices running Android 4.2, there was definitely a clear winner in terms of butteriness. After using the insanely buttery Nexus 4, it was kind of difficult to move back and forth between the Nexus 10 and the Nexus 7. They may have bigger screens, but despite that, neither the 10 nor the 7 performed as well on screen in terms of butteriness as compared to the Nexus 4. I mean, sometimes the Nexus 10 would run smooth, and then at other times it would stutter. And it becomes painfully apparent that the Nexus 7 is a slow device, especially when compared to the Nexus 4. What about the speakers? The speaker on the back of the Nexus 4 worked, but it was really optimized for voice. The speaker on the back of the Nexus 7 was marginally better than that on the Nexus 4. Not only do I appreciate the sound coming out of the speakers on the Nexus 10, I appreciate their front-facing position as well. So what about apps? Plenty of them seem to be optimized for this screen. Some of them seem to be optimized for this screen. And a couple of them seem to be optimized for this screen. I mean, the Nexus 10 is nice, it's just that a lot of the apps have to play catch-up, specifically to take advantage of the screen size. But for the most part, text reads fine, media plays fine on any one of the Nexus devices. While YouTube Playback was just fine on the Nexus 4 and the 7, I did notice that for some inexplicable reason, there'd be a few dropped frames in YouTube Playback on the Nexus 10. Hardly perceivable by most. Still, I'm left wondering if it's too many pixels for Android to handle specifically with this hardware, the Nexus 10. The browser mark test seems to be running just fine on the Nexus 7, a hair better on the Nexus 4, and dropping frames left and right on the Nexus 10. Again, the Nexus 4 seems to have a slightly smoother frame rate compared to the Nexus 7. And despite having started the Browser Mark 2.0 test on the Nexus 10 first, I'm still waiting to move to the next test. And for argument's sake, I turned off any animated wallpaper that might have caused any issues with performance. The 10 just reset itself. The Nexus 7 got a performance score of 1933. The Nexus 4 got a score of 1985. And finally, the Browser Mark benchmark has completed on the Nexus 10 with a performance score of 1935. I launched Asphalt 7 Heat first on the Nexus 7, and it's still loading. On the Nexus 4, I'm ready to play. It definitely loaded faster than either one on the Nexus 10. The Nexus 4 definitely shows animations and transitions in a smoother fashion than either the Nexus 7 or the Nexus 10. Let's play! Really smooth frame rate on the Nexus 4. Oop, some drop frames. Whoa, where'd my frames go on the Nexus 7? They're not in the game.
Frame droppage!
How sad is it that I play better when I'm not touching the screen? Let's see how well I do on the Nexus 10. Smooth. Although I gotta tell you, it's not as smooth when there are a lot of elements on the screen. Not very buttery in the turns either. Although I would say no better or no worse than that on the Nexus 4. Okay, maybe a hair worse. And I'm not talking about my driving. Nexus 7 gameplay? Meh. Nexus 4 gameplay? Smooth. Nexus 10 gameplay? Hit or miss. See, it's smooth sometimes, and then stuttery other times. And again, my virtual driving skills have nothing to do with it. Let's take a look at Flipboard on all the devices. Oh, I can't. The Nexus 10 isn't compatible yet. I told you, not a lot of apps are available for the bigger screens yet. Okay, let's try Pulse. There are a few dropped frames in the animation, but scrolling between the various resources on the Nexus 4 is relatively smooth. The Nexus 10 is far less responsive. I'm just saying, in terms of animations, they're just not very smooth on the 10. Specifically, when compared to the 4. The 7 is a hair more responsive than the 10, but also lags in other places. I don't know, performance just seemed to be hit or miss with the 7 and the 10. Again, when compared to the 4. And the reason you would get a Nexus 10 over the other two devices is that you're looking for a larger screen. The reason that you'd get a Nexus 7 over the other two devices is that you have only $200 to spend. And the reason you would get a Nexus 4 over the other two devices is that you're looking for the best Android experience around. For $200, the Nexus 7 isn't bad. For $400, the Nexus 10 is okay. But for $300, the 4 is tough to beat. So you only have $200 to spend, and you want a good Android experience. Save your pennies. Get the 4. Between a $200 Nexus 7 and a $400 Nexus 10, it's a draw. The overarching experience is just missing from the 7 and the 10. I think large screen Android apps will get here eventually, but that's not even my issue with them. The experience difference between all these devices, to me, is night and day between the 7 and the 10 and the 4. This has become my go-to Android experience. I suppose if I had anything negative to say about the Nexus 4 in comparison to the Nexus 7 or the Nexus 10, it's that its glass back is so slick, the damn thing keeps sliding off my desk. I'm not even kidding either. I showed you in my vlog the other day. It's kind of funny, but also kind of annoying. So you don't have a large screen. You're smooth. I like larger screens and all, but I just don't like the stutter. Oh yeah, that's a super high resolution. The problem is the software isn't really optimized for the hardware yet. And that's certainly more apparent on the 10 compared to the 4. I do believe that Google is working on the problem, optimizing Android for a variety of experiences, but it just seems to me that the Nexus 10, possibly even the Nexus 7, will become better products with the next iteration of Android. I admit it, the Nexus 4 kind of ruined me. The experiences on the other two products just paled by comparison. What you value most may be completely different from what I value. I have my favorite of the trio. Which one would you pick, and why?